I'm going to put it to you that Yeshua drank the cup of the adulterous wife and he took on her punishment. We read in Galatians 3, Messiah has redeemed us from the curse of the Torah, having become a curse for us. For it is written, cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree. And indeed, we read in Matthew 7, they wagged by, reviled him, wagging their heads. So, we are the unfaithful wife, the idolaters, the ones who've committed this terrible act. And Yeshua has accepted the cup of bitter waters in our place. Instead of us becoming a curse, he did. Matthew 26:39 says, he went a little further, this is in Gethsemane, and fell on his face, and he prayed just before he goes to the cross, and he said, Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. The cup of the bitter waters. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as thou wilt. And we read of the thigh wasting away. Genesis 24:9 we read, and the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham, his master, and sware to him concerning that matter. In Genesis 47, the time drew nigh that Israel must die, and he called his son Joseph and said to him, if now I have found grace in thy sight, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh, deal kindly and truly with me, bury me not, I pray thee, in Egypt. For someone to allow his hand to be sat on was a sign of submission to authority. So the thigh wasting away speaks of one's credibility being useless. And in Matthew 27 we read, saying, you that destroys the temple and builds it in 3 days, save yourself. If you be the Son of God, come down from the cross. Likewise also the chief priests mocked him with the scribes and elders, and they said, he saved others, he himself he cannot save. If he be the King of Israel, let him now come down from the cross, and we will believe him. He trusted in God, let him deliver him now, if he will have him. For he said, I'm the Son of God. In Isaiah 50, we read of Yeshua. I gave my back to the smiters and my cheeks to them that plucked off the hair. I hid not my face from shame and spitting. For the Lord God will help me, therefore shall I not be confounded. Therefore I have set my face like a flint, and I know that I shall not be ashamed. So they mocked him, and they mock him still, don't they? The world that just doesn't understand who he is and what he has done. But compare that with Yeshua's return. Out of his mouth goes a sharp sword. With it he should smite the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. He treads the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God. And on his vesture and on his thigh he has a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Everyone will recognize his authority. And we are told that every knee will bow before him. So, Yeshua, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, took the cup. He became a curse among his people, his thigh wasted away, and his abdomen swelled. He suffered for us. He endured the curse of the unfaithful wife. And Luke 22:44, being in agony, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was as it were great drops of blood falling to the ground. So physically, Yeshua's thigh would have been wasted from trying to push himself to get every breath. And science says that his lungs would fill with fluids, thus pulling them down and forcing his abdomen to swell out too. And Yeshua's ordeal actually begins in the Garden of Gethsemane. And we recall in scriptures that he went there after the Last Supper to pray. Gethsemane means olive press, so we know that it was an olive orchard and it would have been springtime, so the olives would have been ripe and smelling good. This would have rather been a beautiful place, but for Yeshua there were other things on his mind. We read in the Gospel of Luke that as he prayed, his sweat became like drops of blood, which is a medical term called hematidrosis, which happens when somebody is under great stress because they know they're about to die. Because of this stress and anxiety, tiny blood vessels around the sweat glands burst and mix with the sweat. This is then brought to the surface with the sweat appearing and being droplets of blood. And it leaves the skin extremely sensitive. Minor pressure on the skin could result in excruciating pain. Those suffering from hematidrosis often scream in agony at the slightest touch because their skin is so sensitive. And late in the night, Judas comes with a mob to arrest Yeshua, it would have been hard to distinguish them apart. They carried torches and small oil lamps, which didn't give off much light. Yeshua and his apostles would have all been wearing white, and they would have had beards, and they would have had their heads covered. Therefore, Judas says, "The one I kiss will be him." So imagine how painful it was, emotionally, but also physically, for Yeshua to be kissed after the blood vessels beneath his flesh had all burst. After the arrest in the middle of the night, Yeshua was next brought before the Sanhedrin and Caiaphas, the high priest. And it is here that the first physical trauma was inflicted. And a soldier struck Yeshua across the face for being silent when questioned by Caiaphas. The palace guards then blindfolded him, mockingly taunted him to identify them as they each passed by. They spat upon him and they struck him in the face. In the early morning, battered and bruised and exhausted, Yeshua is taken to Pontius Pilate, who sends him to Herod. And we read in Luke 23, "And Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then, arraying him in splendid clothing, he sent him back to Pilate." Now, throughout this time where he was harassed and questioned, he did not have anything to eat or drink, nor did he sleep. His body would have been fatigued, and it is likely from the hematidrosis that he would have been dehydrated. And early in the morning, Pilate had enough, and he wanted to satisfy the Sanhedrin, the Jewish people, the heads. He thought by having Yeshua scourged, it would be enough. I've seen a few accounts, and I've mentioned it recently, about scourging. It was effectively like, it was almost as good as a sentence to death, because the punishment of a scourge was so incredibly brutal. It's hard to even imagine. Scourging has got to be one of the most terrible tortures there are. A Roman citizen couldn't be scourged because it was considered so awful a thing to happen to a person. The Romans used the flagrum or flagellum to do the scourging. It had a wooden handle with thongs of rawhide were attached, onto which lead, bone, glass and spikes were attached at the end, arrayed in a dumbbell-shaped pattern. When flicked at a body, the dumbbells would wrap around the victim and embed into the flesh. Once it is pulled out, the victim would bleed profusely. When we consider what happened to Yeshua, please don't also forget the mental abuse that went along with the physical torture as well. The scourging, the prisoner stripped of his clothing and his hands tied to a post above his head. The heavy whip is brought down with full force again and again across Yeshua's shoulders, his back and his legs. Then, as the blows continue, they cut deeper into the subcutaneous tissues, producing first an oozing of blood from the capillaries and veins of the skin, finally spurting arterial bleeding from vessels in the underlying muscles. The small balls of lead first produce large, deep bruises which are broken open easily by subsequent blows. And finally, the skin of the back is hanging in long ribbons, and the entire area is an unrecognizable mass of torn, bleeding tissue. Over a series of beatings, a mist of blood would envelop the area around the victim. The victim was soon unrecognizable. With Yeshua's skin being extremely sensitive from the hematidrosis, the pain Yeshua would have experienced would be unfathomable. When it is determined by the centurion in charge that the prisoner is near death, the beating is finally stopped. The half-fainting Yeshua is then untied and allowed to slump to the stone pavement, wet with his own blood. By Jewish law, a person was only allowed to be scourged a maximum of 40 times. Usually they only scourged them 39 times because 40 was an unlucky number. However, Yeshua was not tried under Jewish law, he was tried under Roman law. By Roman law, there was no maximum number. If the victim were going to be crucified, they would only beat them mildly, so they would still have some strength. If the victim were not going to be crucified, the Romans were allowed to beat the victim within an inch of their life. Yeshua, at the time of the scourging, was not going to be crucified. So there was no need to hold back. It's quite remarkable, isn't it, when you think? And he says, the plough was ploughed upon my back, and they made long furrows. While the body is being scourged, water and other fluids gather around the pleural sac near the heart and the lungs. This is called pleural effusion and plays a significant part in the scriptures. We read in John 19, one of the soldiers with a spear pierced his side, and forthwith came out there blood and water. So Yeshua would have lost a lot of fluid in the form of blood and sweat, making him very weak. Once Yeshua was properly scourged, his torturers sought the need to humiliate and torture him more. They draped a rough cloth over him and placed on his head a crown of thorns. Most people think of the crown of thorns as a circlet. How many have envisaged this? In all actuality, it probably would have looked more like a cap. After all, the king's crowns in that day were actually made out of flowers in a cap-like shape. A thorny cap would sufficiently mock Yeshua as the king of the Jews and keep with the norm of the day. And it is believed that the crown of thorns was made from a base of Ziziphus spina Christi plant, filled in with the Gundelia tuna forti plant, which in the springtime has 1 to 2 inch thorns as well as flowery bulbs. When the cap of thorns was placed on Yeshua's head, the spikes would have irritated or penetrated the trigeminal lobes in the front of the head as well as the greater occipital lobes in the back of the head. An immense amount of pain would start from the head and spread throughout the whole body. People who have damaged either of these lobes today usually freeze in pain. Most of them commit suicide because the pain is so great and doesn't go away. And to make matters worse, Yeshua's torturers mocked him and hit him on the head with reeds, forcing the cap of thorns to penetrate further into his skull. Shortly after scourging, Pilate ordered that Yeshua be shown to the Sanhedrin, and they were still not satisfied. It was obvious to Pilate that the only way he could satisfy the Sanhedrin was to have Yeshua crucified. Finding no fault in Yeshua, Pilate had the people decide who should be crucified in the hope that they would request Yeshua to be released and the other prisoner, Barabbas, to be crucified. However, the crowd shouted for Yeshua to be crucified. And they shouted for Barabbas, whose name actually means son of the Father, for him to be set free. And after washing his hands, Pilate gave the orders for Yeshua's death. Imagine, it's very difficult, isn't it, to imagine how he must have felt stood there before all these people that he was dying for. And they're all screaming that he should be crucified. Once the condemnation was made, Yeshua would have been prepared for crucifixion. The Romans would have, the victims carried the patibulum, which was the horizontal part of the cross. It was an unfinished timber, very rough, weighing between 70 to 120 pounds. It was meant to be used over and over again. Normally the victims carried the patibulum naked for the hour's walk, and this was to increase shame. Yeshua, we read, was clothed in a garment during this time and stripped when he reached Golgotha. Either way, the rough timber still would have been brutal on the back of a scourged man. The weight would have been unbearable in his weakened state. It is no wonder that we read that after Yeshua fell, the Romans appointed the help of Simon of Cyrene to help carry the patibulum. Yeshua by them is in so much pain from the scourging and was so weak from not having any food, water, or rest. The Romans would not have wanted him to die before he could experience crucifixion. He was not going to get away that easy. Still, however, Yeshua would have been mocked, punched, and tripped by the crowds that gathered, as well as spat at. We read in Isaiah 53, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hid their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. And indeed in Isaiah 52, as many were astonished at thee, his visage was so marred more than any man, and his form more than the sons of men. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. Psalm 22. All who see me mock me. They make mouths at me and they wag their heads. He trusts in Yehovah, let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. And there was still no relief in sight when the victims made it to Golgotha, known as the place of the skull. When Yeshua reached the place where the stipes was, the vertical part of the cross, rough timber for several uses, we read that he was stripped. The best example I've ever heard to imagine the sort of pain that would have been for him to endure is to think of a time you've had a Band-Aid on and it is ripped off by you or someone else. Imagine those Band-Aids all over your body ripped off at the same time and multiply that pain by 100. The soldiers were not merciful. All of his wounds from scourging would have been reopened. Any bleeding that had been clotted would have resumed. And then after this, he was stripped. Yeshua would have been laid down on the patibulum, whereupon 7-inch nails were driven through his wrists, not his hands, his wrists. The palm could not support the weight of the body. However, if a nail were driven through the wrist in a place called the space of desktop, the 3 wrist bones located there would have moved aside, creating a hole for the nail to go through. The wrist would also be able to support the weight of the body. Biblical Greek, the word yad, is the same for wrist and hand. That is why on our Bibles the word hand is used, and the art usually depicts the nails in Yeshua's palms. When the nails were driven through the wrist, the pain of the victim would have been almost unfathomable. The nail would have irritated or ruptured the median nerve, causing what is called causalgia, which causes a lightning-sharp pain that spreads throughout the entire body. Patients today who suffer from this and in so much pain, not even morphine can help relieve it. Also, when the median nerve is damaged, as discovered by Dr. Pierre Barbet in 1932, there is a sudden and permanent reflex of the thumb snapping inward to the palm, which is similar to trigger finger. And from this point forward, the victim would have no use of his thumbs. And after Yeshua was nailed through the wrist, he would have been hoisted up on the stipes and a nail would have been driven through his feet. This would have caused rupture or irritation to the plantar nerves, which would have the same type of pain that is associated with that and the median nerve in the wrists. All the feet could be fixed onto the sides of the stipes or a wooden footrest. They usually were nailed directly to the front of the stipes. To accomplish this, flexion of the knees may have been quite prominent and the bent legs may have been rotated laterally. The left foot was pressed back against the right foot with both feet extended, toes down. A 7 to 9 inch nail was driven through the arch of each between the second and third metatarsal bones. The knees would usually be flexed at 45 degrees. In this position, the nail would sever the dorsal pedal artery of the foot, but the resultant bleeding would be insufficient to cause death. It is important to note that while Yeshua was on the cross, he would have been completely naked. This was intentioned to bring about a great amount of shame and humility, to show that the victim is helpless and is nothing, as well as to show the power of the Romans. In Hebrews 12 we read, "Looking unto Yeshua, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God." Shame stripped away every earthly support that Yeshua had. His friends gave way in shame and abandonment. His reputation gave way in shame and mockery. His decency in shame and nakedness. His comfort in shaming torture. His glorious dignity gave way to the utterly undignified, degrading reflexes of grunting and groaning and screeching. And it was not uncommon that while victims were on the cross, birds of prey would be nipping at their flesh and insects would feast on them, covering them as they do with fresh roadkill. The pain and humiliation Yeshua would have been going through is indescribable. And on the cross, as Yeshua slowly sagged down with more weight on the nails in the wrists, excruciating fiery pain shot along the fingers and up the arms to explode in the brain. The nails in the wrists were putting pressure on the median nerve, large nerve trunks which traversed the mid-wrist and hand. As he pushed himself upward to avoid this stretching torment, he placed his full weight on the nail through his feet. Again, there was searing agony as the nail tore through the nerves between the metatarsal bones of his feet. At this point, another phenomenon occurred. As the arms fatigued, great waves of cramps swept over the muscles, knotting them in deep, relentless, throbbing pain. With these cramps came the inability to push himself upwards. Hanging by the arm, the pectoral muscles, the larger muscles of the chest were paralyzed. The intercostal muscles, the small muscles between the ribs, were unable to act. Air could be drawn into the lungs but could not be exhaled. Yeshua fought to raise himself in order to get even one short breath. And while he was on the cross, darkness covered the land noon to 3 p.m. And Yeshua associates those who arrested him with the power of darkness. And we read, "And I was with you day after day in the temple. You did not lay hands on me, but this is your hour and the power of darkness." And we read in Psalm 22, "Many bulls surround me, strong bulls of Bashan encircle me, roaring lions tearing their prey, open their mouths wide against me." And it's an impossible position to maintain. With the knees flexed at 45 degrees, the victim must bear his weight with the muscles of the thigh. However, this is an almost impossible task. Try to stand with your knees flexed at 45 degrees for 5 minutes. The strength of the legs gives out. The weight of the body must now be borne by the arms and shoulders. The result is that within a few minutes of being placed on the cross, the shoulders will become dislocated. Minutes later, the elbows and wrists become dislocated. The result of these dislocations is the arms are as much as 6 to 9 inches longer than normal. With the arms dislocated, considerable body weight is transferred to the chest, causing the rib cage to be elevated in a state of perpetual inhalation. Consequently, in order to exhale, the victim must push down on his feet to allow the rib muscles to relax. The problem is the victim cannot push very long because the legs are extremely fatigued. As time goes on, the victim is less and less able to bear weight on the legs, causing further dislocation of the arms and fears a rising of the chest wall, making breathing more and more difficult. There's not a single thing of this that is not absolute agony, is it? "I am poured out like water, all my bones are out of joint," talking about this dislocation. "My heart is like wax, is melted within my breast." The result of this process is a series of catastrophic physiological effects. Because the victim cannot maintain adequate ventilation of the lungs, the blood oxygen level begins to diminish and the blood carbon dioxide level begins to rise. This process sets up a vicious cycle of increasing oxygen demand which cannot be met, followed by an ever-increasing heart rate. The rising carbon dioxide level stimulates the heart to beat faster in order to increase the delivery of oxygen and the removal of carbon dioxide. Due to the shallow breathing, the victim's lungs begin to collapse in small areas, causing hypoxia and hypercapnia. Respiratory acidosis with lack of compensation by the kidneys due to the loss of blood from the numerous beatings resulted in an increased strain on the heart, which beats faster to compensate. After several hours, the heart begins to fail, the lungs collapse and fill up with fluid, which further increases oxygen delivery to the tissues. The blood loss and hyperventilation combines to cause severe hydration. For a period of several hours, the combination of collapsing lungs, a failing heart, dehydration, and the inability to get adequate oxygen supplies to the tissues cause the eventual death of the victim. "My heart is like wax, it is melted in the midst of my bowels." Spasmodically, Yeshua was able to push himself upward to exhale and bring in life-giving oxygen. It was undoubtedly during these periods that he uttered the 7 short sentences that are recorded. And he suffered hours of limitless pain, cycles of twisting, joint-rending cramps, intermittent partial asphyxiation, and searing pain as tissue was torn from his lacerated back from his movement up and down against the rough timbers of the cross. Then another agony began, a deep crushing pain in the chest as the pericardium, the sac surrounding the heart, slowly filled with serum and began to compress the heart. In Luke 23, Yeshua said, I've gone through all this. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." And they cast lots to divide his garments. And the people stood by watching. The rulers scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself. If he is the Christ of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying, "If you're the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him saying, "This is the king of the Jews." Psalm 22 says, "My strength is dried up like a potsherd." Talking of this great dehydration, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. You lay me in the dust of death. While Yeshua was on the cross, his body would have been going through a variety of states. Stomach would have stopped functioning altogether, possibly causing the stomach acids to drain into the intestines. Heart beating faster and faster. His lips would begin to protrude from his mouth. His mouth would become so dry, his tongue would dry out and cleave to the roof of his mouth. This would all cause him to have an extreme thirst, which is noted by the scripture when he said, I thirst. Not be enough blood going to all his muscles, even though the heart was beating ever faster. All of his systems would have begun to shut down. Lose control of his bowels, causing further humiliation. Sweat, high in urea due to the beating he's endured, would have covered his body as well as his blood. His legs would have been unbelievably swollen. His blood pressure would be extremely low. He would be breathing very heavily. So finally, his heart would stop. It's theorized that Yeshua either died by suffocation or by 3 types of shock. Hypovolemic shock, which is the loss of blood and fluids. Traumatic shock caused by all of the injuries he had endured, and cardiogenic shock, which is when the heart fails as a pump due to previously mentioned types of shock. And he went through all that for you. It's quite remarkable, isn't it? And I focus on it today. It's not what I want to focus on when I think of Yeshua all the time, because I think of him as the King of glory. But to be reminded of all that he went through for us, I think is a good thing, especially for all those who might want to grumble and might want to complain and might be considering running after other gods or running back to Egypt and all that rubbish. And I consider the great love that my King has for me and what he did for me. There's nothing that measures against it. So ask yourself, will you serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness?